"Is your mind constantly on what's under my skirt?" the widow said to young Cowboy. The town of Cedar Creek was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Dust hung in the air during the day, rising from the dirt roads whenever a wagon or horse passed. Wooden buildings leaned slightly, their paint faded by years of harsh sun and wind. Life here was simple, but it could be harsh, especially for those who had to face it alone. Margaret Hill, the widow, had lived in Cedar Creek all her life. She was known for her strong will and sharp tongue. She had inherited her husband's farm after he passed unexpectedly 2 years ago. Life had become a series of endless chores, tending the small herd of cows, repairing the barn, fetching water from the well, and making sure her small garden survived the relentless sun. Even with her neighbors nearby, she often felt the weight of solitude pressing down on her shoulders. Margaret had learned early on that being a woman in Cedar Creek meant being tough. People would gossip if she showed even a hint of weakness. She had to be careful, not just with her work, but also with her words. She carried herself with a pride born from necessity, and the townsfolk respected her for it. At the same time, her independence sometimes made her lonely. The kind of loneliness that came from doing everything alone, yet still wanting someone who could understand her life and struggles. One spring morning, the sun had barely risen when the sound of hooves echoed down the dirt road. A young cowboy rode into town, his hat tilted slightly over his eyes. He was new to Cedar Creek, and most of the townspeople had only heard about him from travelers passing through. His name was Daniel. He had a kind face, though, a bit inexperienced and unsure in the ways of the town. He carried himself with the pride of youth, yet there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes that suggested he was still learning how to handle life on his own. Daniel had come to Cedar Creek seeking work. Stories of opportunities and the chance to start fresh had drawn him west. But like many young men, he quickly realized that life on the frontier was not as easy as he imagined. Jobs were scarce, and a newcomer had to prove himself through hard work, honesty, and perseverance. The day Daniel arrived at the Hill farm, Margaret was in the middle of repairing a broken fence. The old posts had rotted in spots, and the fence now leaned dangerously. She was attempting to hammer a post back into place when Daniel rode up, holding his hat in his hands. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but tinged with nervousness. "I'm Daniel. I'm new in town, and I was wondering if you might need some help around the farm." Margaret paused, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, honesty maybe, or maybe just inexperience, but she could not ignore the caution that had been drilled into her by years of living alone. "I don't know," she said finally. "Most men in town don't last a week before they complain about the work, and I don't need someone getting in the way of my chores." Daniel nodded, undeterred. "I'm willing to work hard. I don't mind doing the hard labor. I just want to earn my keep." Margaret considered him for a long moment. She wasn't used to people asking politely, especially strangers. Most came looking for a quick favor or a handout. There was something different about Daniel. Perhaps it was the way he stood firmly, not demanding, but not shrinking away either. "All right," she said, her voice cautious but firm. "You can start by fixing the barn door. It's been loose for months, and if the wind catches it, it'll break completely." Daniel set to work without complaint. He pulled the old planks into place, tightened loose hinges, and hammered them carefully. Margaret watched from a distance, impressed by his determination and focus. She had expected someone clumsy or easily frustrated, but Daniel worked steadily, never once complaining about the heat or the hard labor. It was late morning when Margaret finally spoke. "Be careful with that hammer. You're not used to farm work, are you?" Daniel glanced up, smiling slightly. "I've done some work before, ma'am, but I've got a lot to learn. You're going to learn quickly here. Cedar Creek doesn't wait for anyone to catch up." As the day wore on, the two of them worked side by side. Margaret felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. She was used to handling everything herself, but there was something about Daniel's presence that was different. He wasn't pushy or overly familiar. He simply worked quietly and diligently, earning her trust little by little. By the time the sun hung high in the sky, Daniel had finished the barn door. Margaret examined the work carefully. It was solid, neat, and done with care. She nodded in approval. "You did good," she said. "Better than I expected." Daniel smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot coming from you." Margaret frowned slightly, a shadow crossing her face. She had learned long ago not to trust appearances. Just because someone worked hard didn't mean they had good intentions. And yet Daniel had shown nothing but respect and honesty that day. It was then, in a moment of frustration and fear of misjudgment, that she blurted out, almost before she could stop herself, "Is your mind constantly on what's under my skirt?" He hadn't expected such a direct and startling question. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came at first. Margaret immediately regretted the words. They were harsher than she intended, but they also revealed her own fear. She had been widowed for 2 years, and men in Cedar Creek often looked at her with less respect than she deserved. Her question was a defense, a way to protect herself from being misunderstood or taken advantage of. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I respect you. I came here to work and to earn my keep, nothing more. I would never think of you in that way." Margaret studied him, searching his face for signs of dishonesty. There were none. She felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. Perhaps she had judged too quickly. Perhaps not every man in Cedar Creek had selfish intentions. The rest of the day passed in a strange tension. Margaret kept her distance, cautious but less hostile. Daniel continued his work, quietly proving his sincerity through action rather than words. He fetched water, repaired fences, and even helped mend the roof where it had started to leak. By evening, the sun dipped low, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Margaret stood by the edge of the garden, watching Daniel feed the animals. She realized something she hadn't expected. She didn't feel alone with him there. His presence, respectful and steady, brought a sense of calm she hadn't known in a long time. Still, she remained guarded. She had learned the hard way that trust was earned slowly, and she would not allow herself to be too vulnerable too soon. Yet, a small part of her hoped that this young cowboy might be different, that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone she could rely on, not just for work, but for understanding and companionship in a town where both were rare. That night, Margaret sat on her porch, the wind carrying the faint smell of the farm into the air. She thought about the young cowboy and the strange way he had entered her life. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of curiosity and cautious hope. Daniel, in his small rented room at the edge of town, thought about the widow as well. He respected her strength, her independence, and the way she carried herself despite hardships. He knew he had to be patient, that trust was fragile, and that proving himself was more than just doing work. It was showing character, respect, and loyalty. And so, in that small town of Cedar Creek, 2 lives began to intersect, tentatively, cautiously, but with the possibility of something meaningful emerging from the dusty roads and hard work of everyday life. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over Cedar Creek, casting a soft golden glow across the dusty streets. Margaret Hill was already up before dawn, tending to her cows and checking the fence lines. Life on the farm had no mercy for laziness, and she had learned to rise with the sun, regardless of how tired her body felt. Daniel arrived soon after, riding his horse down the familiar path to the hill farm. He carried a small satchel with his tools, ready for another day of work. Unlike the first day, there was a subtle ease in his step, a quiet confidence born from knowing what to expect. Still, he felt the tension lingering from the conversation the previous evening. Margaret's blunt question had startled him, but it also made him determined to prove himself as trustworthy and respectable. Margaret noticed him approaching and gave a small nod. She didn't speak, but there was a hint of acknowledgement in her eyes. The work they had to do today was extensive. The barn had been repaired, but the garden needed attention, and the old fence surrounding the property had several loose posts that threatened to collapse if left unattended. "Start with the fence posts," Margaret said finally. "The cattle are restless, and if they break through, it will be a mess by tonight." Daniel nodded and dismounted, rolling up his sleeves. He approached the first post and examined it carefully. Unlike the barn, which had been straightforward, the fence required more patience and attention. Some posts were almost rotten, others had been moved by animals, and a few needed to be dug out entirely and replaced. Margaret worked nearby, digging and lifting with surprising strength. Daniel noticed how precise she was, each movement purposeful. There was a rhythm to her work, a balance of experience and care that only years of hard labor could teach. He respected her silently, keeping his distance while assisting when necessary, always waiting for her to direct him. The morning passed with the steady sound of hammers, shovels, and the occasional lowing of cattle. Though there were no words spoken between them at first, a kind of understanding was forming. Margaret could see that Daniel was not only capable but also patient. He didn't rush, didn't complain, and didn't try to take over. Instead, he worked alongside her, matching her pace and effort. During a brief pause, Margaret wiped her brow and leaned on her shovel. She studied Daniel carefully. He was young, perhaps too young to fully understand the hardships of life here, yet there was determination in his eyes that she could not ignore. "You have more patience than most men I've met," she said finally. Her tone was neutral, but there was a hint of admiration. Daniel glanced up, a small smile forming on his lips. "I've had to learn patience in my travels," he replied. "And I've learned that rushing through work often makes it worse." Margaret nodded, sensing the honesty in his words. She had spent too many years working with men who took shortcuts or expected praise for minimal effort. Daniel seemed different. She didn't yet trust him completely, but she felt that her judgment might have been too harsh the first day. As the day continued, a few townsfolk passed by. They paused briefly to watch the young cowboy work with the widow. Whispers followed in their wake. "Do you see that young man helping Margaret Hill? Wonder what his intentions are," one woman said quietly to her companion. Margaret felt a familiar surge of frustration. Gossip was a constant in Cedar Creek, and it had taken her years to learn how to ignore it. But she knew that the presence of this young man would fuel rumors, no matter his intentions. She glanced at Daniel, who was carefully adjusting a fence post, and felt a pang of worry. She didn't want him to be judged unfairly, and she didn't want the town to assume the worst about him, or about her. By midday, they had made significant progress on the fence. The sun was high, and both were covered in dust and sweat, but the sense of accomplishment was rewarding. Daniel paused and offered Margaret a water flask. She took it gratefully, her hands shaking slightly from the effort of lifting the posts and hammering the nails. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's been a long morning." Daniel nodded. "You're welcome, ma'am. I can't imagine doing this work alone all the time." Margaret gave a small smile, but didn't respond further. She wasn't used to accepting compliments, especially from men, but she appreciated his thoughtfulness. After a short break, Margaret decided to take them to the garden. It had been neglected due to her focus on other chores, and weeds had begun to grow between the vegetable plants. The garden was small but vital, providing fresh vegetables for the household. Margaret prided herself on her gardening skills, and she was particular about how things were planted and maintained. Daniel followed her instructions carefully, kneeling in the dirt and gently removing the weeds. Margaret observed him closely, correcting his technique when necessary. "Be careful not to pull too hard," she advised. "You don't want to disturb the roots of the plants." Daniel nodded, grateful for the guidance. "I understand, ma'am. I'll be careful." As they worked, Margaret found herself talking more than she usually did. She told him about the farm, her late husband, and the struggles of running the property alone. Daniel listened intently, asking questions when appropriate, but mostly allowing her to share her experiences. There was a rhythm to their conversation, one that balanced work and storytelling. Despite the tension from the previous day, a sense of trust was beginning to form. Margaret could see that Daniel genuinely wanted to help, not for personal gain or attention, but because he cared about doing the work properly. She found herself appreciating his company, even if she didn't yet fully admit it to herself. By late afternoon, the work was nearly done. The fence stood firm, the garden was clear of weeds, and the animals were settled. Margaret leaned against the porch railing, catching her breath and letting the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. Daniel stood nearby, wiping sweat from his forehead, his hat tilted back. "You did well today," Margaret said, her tone more relaxed than before. "I think the farm will be in good shape for a while." "I'm glad I could help, ma'am. I hope I've made the work a little easier for you." She realized that despite the gossip, despite her own initial suspicions, Daniel had proven himself to be reliable, respectful, and hard-working. Perhaps her first impression had been too cautious, influenced by fear and loneliness. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold, Margaret and Daniel paused to watch the horizon. There was a quiet peace in the moment, a sense of accomplishment and mutual respect that neither had expected at the start of the day. Margaret broke the silence. "You're not like other men, are you?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to him. Daniel looked at her thoughtful. "I hope not, ma'am. I've made mistakes before, but I want to do the right thing. Especially here, with you." Margaret felt a mix of emotions, caution, curiosity, and a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she could see that this young cowboy might be different. For the first time in a long while, she felt that perhaps someone could enter her life without bringing harm or disappointment. The day ended quietly, with Daniel riding back to town and Margaret settling in for the evening. Both reflected on the day's work and the slow but steady bond that was forming between them. It was not love, not yet, but a beginning of understanding, trust, and respect. And in the small town of Cedar Creek, where life was hard and gossip was constant, such beginnings were rare and valuable. Both Margaret and Daniel knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, they were willing to walk it together, carefully, cautiously, but with the hope that trust and friendship could grow into something meaningful. The morning came with an unusual stillness. The sun rose slowly, and the wind that usually swept across Cedar Creek was eerily quiet. Margaret Hill stepped outside to tend to her cattle and noticed something that made her stomach twist. One of the fences near the northern edge of her property had been broken overnight. A large section of the wooden barrier had collapsed, and the cattle had wandered out into the open field. Margaret's heart sank. "Not again," she muttered under her breath. She had repaired that section only last week. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had caused a serious problem. She needed to act quickly before the cattle wandered too far, or someone in town reported them missing. Daniel arrived shortly after, carrying his tools and a bundle of rope. He had been walking down the dirt road when he saw Margaret's expression. "What happened, ma'am?" he asked. "This," she said shortly. "The fence didn't hold. The cattle are out, and we need to bring them back before anyone notices. If one of them gets hurt, it's on me." Daniel's eyes scanned the field. A few cows were grazing far from the farm, seemingly calm but vulnerable. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll get them back. Just tell me what you need me to do." Margaret felt a rush of relief. She had already begun running toward the cattle when Daniel started helping, moving with surprising speed and precision for someone his age. Together they worked methodically, guiding the animals back toward the farm. Margaret shouted instructions and Daniel followed quickly, closing gaps in the fence temporarily with rope to keep the cattle from wandering again. Once the cattle were secured, Margaret examined the broken fence more carefully. The posts had been rotted underneath, hidden from view, and the top beam had snapped. It wasn't intentional sabotage, but it was still a dangerous problem. "We need to fix this properly," she said, frustration and worry mixing in her voice. Daniel nodded. "Let's gather the tools and new wood. We'll get it done today." Margaret lifted heavy posts while Daniel drilled, hammered, and tied ropes to support the new beams. The work was exhausting, but neither complained. The crisis demanded focus, and both of them knew that teamwork was essential. During a short pause, Margaret took a moment to catch her breath. "I'm impressed," she said quietly, not looking directly at him. "You didn't hesitate when the cattle wandered off. Most men your age would have panicked or blamed me." Daniel smiled, brushing sweat from his brow. "I didn't panic because you didn't. You stayed calm and focused. I just tried to follow your lead." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest at his words. She realized that in this young man there was not just skill but also patience, intelligence, and respect. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps Cedar Creek had more to offer than loneliness and struggle. By midday, the new fence was half rebuilt. The sun beat down and dust clung to their clothes and skin, but there was satisfaction in their progress. As they worked, a few townsfolk passed by and noticed their efforts. They paused, watching the widow and the young cowboy labor side by side.
Whispers began again, though this time with a tone of admiration rather than suspicion. "Look at them," one neighbor remarked quietly.
"They're handling that mess better than anyone else could." Margaret caught a fragment of the conversation and frowned. Gossip was a constant companion in Cedar Creek, but she reminded herself that it was better when it reflected hard work than assumptions. She continued working, focusing on the fence, her hands steady despite the fatigue. Daniel, noticing her determination, decided to lighten the mood. "You know," he said carefully, "you could probably build a fence in your sleep." Margaret glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe," she replied. "But I like having a little help. It makes the work less lonely." Daniel nodded, understanding her words. "I'll keep helping, ma'am, as long as you'll let me." The afternoon brought another challenge. A sudden windstorm swept across the field, lifting dust and scattering leaves and small branches. The partially rebuilt fence wobbled dangerously in the gusts. Margaret's heart raced. "We need to secure it before it falls," she shouted. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed a length of rope and ran toward the fence. "Hold it steady here," he called, tying knots quickly while Margaret supported the heavy beams. They moved in perfect coordination, their actions almost instinctive after hours of working together. The wind continued to howl, but the fence held, thanks to their combined effort. When the storm finally passed, both were covered in dust and sweat, but the fence stood strong. Margaret looked at Daniel, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief and gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you today," she admitted quietly. Daniel shrugged, a small smile on his face. "I'm glad I could help, ma'am. You handled the storm just as well as I did." For a moment they stood in silence, catching their breath and surveying their work. There was a bond forming between them. one built on shared effort, respect, and trust. Margaret realized that her initial fear of misjudging Daniel was fading. He had shown her that character mattered more than gossip, appearances, or first impressions. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Margaret invited Daniel to sit on the porch. She fetched a small jug of water and 2 cups, offering one to him. "You earned this," she said. Daniel accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. I've learned a lot today, and not just about fences." Margaret raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh?" Daniel nodded. "About patience, about trust, about how hard work can bring people together, even strangers." Margaret smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. "You might be right about that," she said. "It's not easy to find someone who works as hard as they care. You've earned my trust today, Daniel. Don't take that lightly." Daniel met her gaze, sincerity shining in his eyes. "I won't, ma'am. I promise." As the evening fell, the farm was quiet, the cattle were safe, the fence was sturdy, and the garden awaited attention tomorrow. Both Margaret and Daniel knew that challenges would come again, as life on the farm was never easy. But for the first time, they faced those challenges together. That night, Margaret sat by her window looking out over the farm. She reflected on the day's events, on the strength, courage, and trust that had been tested and proven. The young cowboy had shown her that not all strangers were to be feared, and that, even in a town filled with judgment and gossip, one could find honesty and reliability. Daniel, in his small room at the edge of town, thought about Margaret as well. He admired her resilience, her independence, and her ability to face challenges without faltering. He understood now why life on a farm required more than strength. It demanded heart, patience, and courage, and he knew he wanted to be a part of that life, helping her and learning from her. In Cedar Creek, trust and respect were earned slowly, day by day, through shared effort and perseverance. Today had been a test, a challenge that neither Margaret nor Daniel had expected, but both had faced it with courage and determination. And in doing so, they had taken the first steps toward a partnership that might, in time, grow into something deeper. Though the sun had set and shadows stretched across the farm, there was a quiet light in both their hearts. It was the light of mutual understanding, of respect earned through action, and of hope for a future where hard work, honesty, and trust could build something stronger than fear or suspicion. The farm was peaceful once more, but both Margaret and Daniel knew that life would continue to challenge them. Yet they also knew that together they were stronger, and in that realization there was a comfort that neither had felt in a long time. The morning after the storm and fence repair brought a sense of calm to the hill farm. The sun rose gently over the fields, and the birds chirped as if nothing had disturbed the peace the day before. Margaret Hill moved about her chores with a steady rhythm, though her mind lingered on the events of the previous day. The crisis had tested both her and Daniel, and she realized that their shared work had built more than a repaired fence. It had built trust. Daniel arrived as usual, carrying his tools and a quiet smile. He dismounted his horse and approached Margaret. "Good morning, ma'am. Looks like the farm survived the storm," he said, glancing at the sturdy fence and the contented cattle grazing in the field. Margaret nodded. "It did, thanks to both of us. You've proven yourself dependable, Daniel. That's not something I say lightly." And Daniel smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "I'll do my best to keep earning your trust, ma'am. I want to help, not just today, but whenever you need me." Margaret felt a warmth at his words. His dedication was genuine, and it reminded her that not everyone in Cedar Creek was quick to judge or selfish in their actions. Yet she also knew that life in a small town meant scrutiny, and not everyone would see Daniel as she did. By midday, as they tended to the garden and repaired smaller fences, a few townsfolk passed by. Their eyes lingered a little too long, and whispers floated in the air. "Look at them again," one woman said quietly. "The widow and the young cowboy working together. I wonder what they're really up to." Margaret felt a familiar pang of frustration. Gossip was constant in Cedar Creek, and it never seemed to end. She had faced it her entire life, from neighbors questioning her independence to men assuming she was weak or naive. Now, with Daniel by her side, she worried that their efforts would be misinterpreted, that the townsfolk would see friendship and trust as something scandalous. Daniel noticed her unease. "Don't let them bother you," he said quietly. "What matters is that we're getting the work done and doing it right. The rest is just talk." It was right, of course. The opinions of others could not dictate her actions or her feelings. But the sting of judgment was familiar, and it took effort to push it aside. She nodded slightly, letting a small smile appear.
"You're right, Daniel. Let's focus on the work."
The day continued with steady labor. They repaired smaller fences, tended to the animals, and cleared weeds from the garden. As they worked, Margaret found herself talking more freely than she had in months. She shared stories of her late husband, the challenges she faced in maintaining the farm, and the moments of quiet triumph when things went right. Daniel listened attentively, asking questions when appropriate, but mostly allowing her to share her experiences. There was no judgment in his gaze, no impatience in his tone, only genuine interest and respect. Margaret felt a sense of relief she hadn't realized she needed. For so long, she had carried the weight of her responsibilities alone, and now, with someone willing to listen and help, she felt lighter. By late afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the farm. Margaret and Daniel paused for a moment, leaning on their tools and taking in the view. The fence stood strong, the garden was tended, and the animals were settled. The farm was in order, and yet Margaret's thoughts wandered to the broader implications of their partnership. "You've been a great help, Daniel," she said softly. "More than I could have hoped for when I first met you. It's not just the work, it's the way you approach everything, with patience and respect." Daniel looked at her, his expression serious. "I appreciate that, ma'am. I've learned a lot from you, too. Not just about farming, but about responsibility, trust, and perseverance. You've shown me that hard work isn't just about physical effort. It's about care and dedication." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest. His words were sincere, and she knew he meant them. For the first time in a long while, she considered the possibility of a partnership. Not in the romantic sense yet, but a connection based on mutual respect, trust, and shared effort. As they prepared to finish their work for the day, a neighbor approached, curious about the activity on the hill farm. "Good afternoon, Margaret, Daniel," the neighbor said, smiling politely. "Looks like you've been busy. The farm hasn't looked this well in months." Margaret nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. "Yes, it's been a productive day," she replied. The neighbor's eyes lingered on Daniel, and Margaret noticed the subtle look of curiosity, perhaps tinged with skepticism. "You're a good helper," the neighbor said to him. "Not many young men would take the work seriously." "Thank you. I'm just doing my best." As the neighbor left, Margaret turned to Daniel. "See? People notice effort, even if they gossip. They just need to see results." Daniel smiled. "I'll keep working hard, ma'am. I want to make a difference not just here, but in the way people see me." The evening brought a quiet moment on the porch. Margaret sat with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Daniel joined her, holding his own cup, and they shared a comfortable silence. The events of the past few days had created a bond between them, one that neither had expected, but both valued deeply. "You've changed a lot in just a few days," Margaret said quietly. "Not just in what you've done, but in the way you handle yourself and the work. I respect that." Daniel looked at her, a small smile forming. "I've learned from the best, ma'am. Your strength and determination have shown me how to face challenges, how to handle responsibility without complaint, and how to earn respect through action rather than words." Margaret felt a sense of pride and satisfaction. She realized that teaching someone, guiding them, and watching them grow was rewarding in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about having help. It was about sharing knowledge, trust, and experience. As the night settled over Cedar Creek, the farm was quiet and peaceful. The challenges of the day had passed, but both Margaret and Daniel knew that life would continue to test them. Yet they faced the future with a growing sense of confidence, knowing that together they could overcome obstacles, whether they were physical, emotional, or social. Margaret reflected on her own growth as well. She had learned to let go of some of her caution, to accept help when it was offered genuinely, and to recognize the value of partnership. Daniel had proven himself not only through hard work, but through patience, respect, and integrity. In Cedar Creek, where judgment and gossip were constant companions, such qualities were rare. And in this rare connection between a widow and a young cowboy, both found a sense of understanding and companionship that neither had expected, but both cherished deeply. Before retiring for the night, Margaret walked through the garden, checking the plants and ensuring that everything was in order. Daniel followed, offering assistance when needed, but mostly observing, learning, and respecting her space. They worked quietly together, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Margaret felt a sense of hope. Life on the farm was hard and the future uncertain, but with someone by her side who respected her, helped her, and earned her trust, the challenges seemed more manageable. She realized that friendship, trust, and understanding were just as important as fences, cattle, and crops. Daniel, looking at the same stars, thought about the days ahead. He knew that building trust and respect was a long journey, one that required patience, honesty, and dedication. But after the events of the past days, he felt confident that he was on the right path, and that his efforts were making a real difference in Margaret's life and in his own. In Cedar Creek, life continued its steady rhythm. Work, gossip, and small-town challenges were constant, but Margaret and Daniel had discovered something rare: trust, respect, and the beginning of a meaningful connection. And though the road ahead would have its difficulties, both were ready to face it together, learning from each other, growing together, and building something stronger than fear or loneliness. The next morning, Cedar Creek awoke to another bright, warm day. The sky was clear, and the sun reflected off the rooftops of the small town, bringing out the earthy colors of the buildings and streets. On the Hill farm, Margaret Hill moved with her usual precision, checking the fences, feeding the animals, and tending to the garden. Life on the farm was steady, repetitive, and sometimes exhausting, but it was the rhythm she had learned to rely on. Daniel arrived soon after, walking his horse up the familiar dirt path. He carried his satchel with tools, ready to help wherever he could. Unlike the first days, there was a comfortable familiarity between him and Margaret now. They no longer had the awkwardness of strangers or the tension of misunderstanding. The relationship had developed through work, trust, and shared experiences, and now it felt natural. "Good morning, ma'am," Daniel called cheerfully. "Looks like another busy day ahead." "It is, but with your help it will go smoothly. Let's start with the northern fence. I want it checked carefully after yesterday's storm."
Together they approached the fence.
Daniel inspected the posts and beams while Margaret guided him on what to look for. They worked efficiently, each movement in sync with the other, showing how much they had learned to communicate without words. As the morning passed, the farm became alive with energy. Chickens clucked in the yard, the cows moved steadily in their pens, and the garden flourished under Margaret's careful guidance. Daniel learned more about her routines, her methods, and her standards. It wasn't just work he was observing. It was life lessons. Lessons about dedication, responsibility, and pride in one's labor. During a brief pause, Margaret looked over at Daniel. "You've learned quickly," she said, a small smile forming. "Not just about the farm, but about how things run around here. I'm impressed." Daniel shrugged, a modest smile on his face. "I've had a good teacher. You've shown me the right way to do things." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest. She realized that in teaching him, she had gained more than just help with her chores. She had found someone who could understand the challenges of her life, someone whose presence was reassuring and dependable. Later in the day, a few townsfolk passed by, as they often did, observing the Hill farm and the young cowboy at work. This time, however, the whispers carried a different tone. "Look at them," one neighbor said. "They work together so well. The farm hasn't been this orderly in years." Margaret noticed the change, but didn't let it affect her. Gossip had always been part of Cedar Creek life, but now it seemed admiration had replaced suspicion. Daniel, however, noticed the whispers and shook his head slightly. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They only notice what they want to. We know the truth. We've done the work." Margaret nodded, appreciating his practicality. "You're right. That's what matters most." By late afternoon, the work was complete. The fences were secure, the garden neat and thriving, and the animals calm. Margaret stood back, surveying the farm. It looked better than it had in months. She felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that their combined effort had made this possible. Daniel approached, brushing dust from his clothes. "We did good work today, ma'am. I think everything is in order." "Yes, everything is, and I appreciate your help more than words can say." For a long moment they stood in silence, enjoying the sense of accomplishment and quiet companionship. It was a comfortable, almost rare feeling for Margaret, who had grown used to facing challenges alone. With Daniel, however, she felt supported, respected, and understood. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, Margaret turned to Daniel. "You've proven yourself, Daniel, not just with your work, but with your character. You've earned my trust completely." Daniel met her gaze, sincerity shining in his eyes. "I've tried my best, ma'am. Your trust means a lot to me, and I won't take it for granted." "I believe you, and I'm glad you're here, not just to help with the farm, but for the presents you bring. It's comforting." Daniel smiled, a warmth spreading across his face. "I feel the same, ma'am. I've learned a lot from you, and I hope to continue learning and helping. You've shown me what real strength and dedication look like." The evening brought a gentle breeze, carrying the earthy scent of the farm and the fresh grass. Margaret and Daniel sat on the porch, sipping water and watching the sky change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. The conversation was light, yet full of understanding, reflecting the bond that had formed between them. Margaret said after a pause, life here isn't easy, but it's days like this, moments like this that make it worthwhile. Having someone you can trust makes a difference. Daniel nodded. I understand that now, and I'm grateful that I get to be part of it, part of your life here. You've changed how I see things too. I spent so long relying only on myself, fearing judgment and disappointment. But now I see that letting someone in doesn't mean weakness. It means strength. And it brings a sense of companionship I didn't realize I needed. I'm glad I could be here, ma'am. Not just to help with the work, but to share this with you. I've learned more about patience, respect, and trust than I ever expected. As the stars appeared in the night sky, both of them felt a quiet contentment. Their partnership had grown stronger through work, trust, and shared experiences. What had started as a young cowboy helping a widow with chores had transformed into a relationship built on mutual respect, understanding, and quiet companionship. Days that followed continued with the steady rhythm of farm life. Each day brought chores, challenges, and the occasional minor mishap, but Margaret and Daniel faced them together. The townsfolk noticed the change in the hill farm and in their interactions, often whispering in admiration rather than suspicion. Margaret had earned their respect, and Daniel had proven himself not only as a capable worker but as a trustworthy companion. Through it all, Margaret and Daniel's bond grew. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was slow, careful, and grounded in real-life experiences. They shared laughter over minor mishaps, discussed solutions to farm problems, and supported each other through exhausting days. Margaret realized that her initial fear of judgment and misunderstanding had faded. She had found someone she could rely on, someone who valued her as a person, not just for her farm or status as a widow. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch again. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and the farm was quiet except for the gentle sounds of animals settling in for the night. Margaret took a deep breath and said softly, Daniel, I never thought I'd feel this way again. Life here is hard, and I've grown used to facing it alone, but having someone like you here, it makes it easier. It makes it feel possible. Daniel looked at her, touched by her honesty. I feel the same, ma'am. You've taught me so much, and being here with you has shown me what it means to truly care, not just about work, but about life and people. Margaret smiled, a rare softness in her expression. Thank you, Daniel, for everything, for the work, the trust, and the companionship. It means more than I can say. Daniel nodded, feeling a quiet pride and happiness. And thank you, ma'am, for letting me be part of your life. I've learned more than I ever expected, and I hope I can continue to earn your trust and respect every day. As the night settled over Cedar Creek, the farm was peaceful. The challenges of the past days had been met with courage, patience, and teamwork. Margaret and Daniel had grown through these experiences, learning about trust, respect, and the value of companionship. Their bond was stronger than gossip, stronger than hardship, and stronger than the doubts that had initially clouded their relationship. In Cedar Creek, life continued its steady rhythm. The work was never ending, the town never stopped talking, and the challenges never ceased. But Margaret and Daniel faced it all together, with the quiet confidence that comes from shared effort and mutual respect. They had learned that trust could be built slowly, friendship could grow through understanding, and companionship could emerge from even the simplest of daily routines. And as the stars twinkled above, Margaret and Daniel knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had each other, and that was enough. The farm, the town, and the world beyond could continue with its trials and judgments, but for Margaret and Daniel, life was now filled with hope, trust, and a sense of connection that neither had expected, but both deeply valued. Their story, grounded in everyday struggles and the simple acts of honesty, effort, and care, had reached a moment of quiet fulfillment, a reminder that respect, patience, and understanding could create bonds stronger than any hardship.